The year 1910. What was happening in the world while Mexico began its revolution? In 1910, Mexico began the Mexican Revolution, a conflict where between 1.5 and 3.5 million Mexicans lost their lives. The cause was to end more than 3 decades of rule by Porfirio Diaz. Paradoxically, although Diaz left Mexico on May 31, 1911, the violence did not truly end until 1929 with the conclusion of the Cristero War. Nevertheless, this event opened a stage of reform, conflict, and national redefinition against the abuses of the Second Industrial Revolution, where factory workers labored 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. These conditions were mirrored in the United States and Germany, where laborers worked 60 hours per week, and in extreme cases, up to 100 hours. It is no coincidence that this decade brought millions of deaths to Europe as well, where World War I caused 15 to 22 million fatalities. This era also saw the birth of the world's first socialist communist state, following the Russian Revolution of 1917, consolidating with the formation of the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, on December 30, 1922. In this video, we will tell you what every region of the world was like at the dawn of the 20th century, and how this year produced effects that transformed the globe, consequences that affect us to this day. Before we dive deep, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our updates. What was happening in Europe? The Anglo-German naval arms race reaches a critical point. At the start of the 20th century, the rivalry between the United Kingdom and the German Empire moved to the sea. Between 1898 and 1912, an intense naval arms race became a significant factor in the European tensions leading up to World War I. Both nations sought to build modern, powerful battleship fleets to secure maritime supremacy. A turning point was the 1906 launch of the HMS Dreadnought, a British battleship that made all previous vessels obsolete. By 1910, British parliamentary pressure increased funding for more units, intensifying the race and fueling a climate of mutual distrust. The Bosnian crisis aftermath hardens alliance systems. The 1908 to 1909 crisis erupted when the Austro-Hungarian Empire formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. This angered Serbia, which hoped to lead the unification of South Slavic peoples with Russian support. Though Russia eventually accepted the annexation in 1909, weakened by its 1905 defeat against Japan, the resentment remained. Serbia now viewed Austria-Hungary as its primary enemy, while Germany confirmed its unconditional support for Vienna, making European alliances more rigid and defensive. What was happening in the United States? Taft signs the Mann-Elkins Act during the Progressive Era. On June 18, 1910, President William Howard Taft signed the Mann-Elkins Act, a major reform that expanded the powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroad rates and telecommunications, telegraph, and telephone. This reflected the federal government's attempt to protect the public interest against large monopolies. The NAACP is established and launches the crisis. Founded in 1909 by black and white activists to fight racial discrimination, the NAACP consolidated its structure in 1910. It launched its official magazine, The Crisis, edited by W.B. Du Bois, which became a platform to denounce lynching and segregation. Washington State revives the women's suffrage movement. In 1910, Washington State approved women's right to vote. This victory proved that suffrage was viable and served as a catalyst for other states, leading up to federal recognition in 1920. What was happening in Spain? The Padlock Law sparks a church-state battle. In 1910, the liberal government pushed the Ley del Candado, Padlock Law, temporarily limiting the establishment of new religious orders to curb the Catholic Church's influence. This sparked intense confrontation between conservatives and anti-clerical Republicans. The CNT is founded in Barcelona. The National Confederation of Labor, CNT, an anarcho-syndicalist union, was founded in 1910. It promoted direct action and the general strike as tools for workers' rights, becoming a central force in Spanish social history. What was happening in the Ottoman Empire? The 1910 Albanian Revolt shakes the Young Turks. An uprising in Kosovo in northern Albania challenged the centralizing policies of the Young Turks, such as new taxes and the imposition of the Ottoman language. Although suppressed, it revealed the fragility of Ottoman power in the Balkans. The CUP consolidates power amid fragmentation. The Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, worked to centralize control, but these policies exacerbated nationalist tensions in Arabia and Anatolia, setting the stage for the empire's eventual disintegration. What was happening in the Arabian Peninsula? Ottoman authority erodes as Ibn Saud rises. By 1910, Ibn Saud had consolidated power in the Najd region, challenging Ottoman control. This power vacuum and Ibn Saud's expansion through tribal alliances anticipated the eventual creation of the modern Saudi state. What was happening in Central Asia? The Palin Commission exposes Russian colonial exploitation. An investigation into the Russian-governed Russian Turkestan revealed systematic abuse, corruption, and land expropriation. The report documented the discontent that would later fuel rebellions during the 1917 Russian revolutions. What was happening in China? The Qing National Consultative Council meets for the first time. In a late attempt at reform, the Qing dynasty held its first consultative meeting in 1910. However, the reforms were seen as too little, too late. Just 1 year later, the Xinhai Revolution would end 2,000 years of imperial rule. What was happening in Japan? The high treason incident crushes the left. Between 1910 and 1911, the Japanese government arrested numerous socialists and anarchists, accusing them of plotting to assassinate Emperor Meiji. 12 activists were executed in 1911, effectively silencing radical political debate for years. What was happening in Korea? Japan formally annexes Korea. On August 22, 1910, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed under coercion. This ended Korean sovereignty and began a period of harsh colonial rule that lasted until 1945, leaving a legacy of deep-seated conflict. What was happening in India? The Morley Minto reforms take effect. The 1909 Indian Councils Act introduced limited Indian participation in legislative councils. However, it also created separate electorates for Muslims, institutionalizing religious divisions and intensifying the push for independence. What was happening in Southeast Asia? Budi Utomo pioneers Indonesian nationalism. Founded in 1908, this organization of Javanese students promoted the cultural and educational development of the indigenous population. While moderate, it represented the awakening of modern nationalism in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. 910. A world on the brink of change. Utomo introduced the idea of a collective indigenous identity and laid the foundation for broader, more politicized nationalist organizations in the following decades. Because of this, 1908 is remembered in Indonesia as the beginning of the national awakening, a process that would culminate in independence in 1945. Australia, the White Australia Policy. At the beginning of the 20th century, the White Australia Policy strictly defined Australian national identity. Consolidated after the 1901 Federation, this policy sought to exclude non-European immigrants, especially Asians and Pacific Islanders, through restrictive immigration laws. By 1910, these regulations were in full force. Tools like the dictation test allowed the rejection of immigrants without explicitly mentioning racial criteria, though its application was clearly discriminatory. The goal was to preserve a homogeneous society based on white supremacy and British ideals, while it began to be gradually dismantled after World War II. In 1910, the policy operated without major challenge, deeply shaping the country's demographics. Africa, segregation and colonialism. The Union of South Africa. On May 31, 1910, the Union of South Africa was created, combining 4 British colonies into a single autonomous dominion. While presented as a step toward stability after the Boer Wars, it was built on racial exclusion. The Constitution guaranteed political power almost exclusively to the white minority, British and Afrikaner, marginalizing the black majority. This institutionalized segregation laid the legal groundwork for what would later become apartheid. The Belgian Congo. In 1908, the Congo Free State officially became the Belgian Congo. This transition followed international outcry over the extreme abuses committed under the personal rule of King Leopold II. By 1910, Belgium introduced administrative reforms to reduce the most flagrant atrocities. However, the system remained an example of extractive colonialism based on forced labor and resource depletion. Central America, dollar diplomacy. Between 1909 and 1910, the United States intervened decisively in Nicaraguan politics as part of dollar diplomacy, a strategy to protect U.S. economic interests through financial and military influence. President Jose Santos Zelaya was overthrown after losing Washington's support. This intervention led to prolonged military occupation by 1912 and created a precedent for U.S. foreign policy in the region throughout the 20th century. South America, progress and conflict. Colombia. In 1910, Carlos E. Restrepo was elected president, marking the beginning of the Republican Union, an attempt to reconcile liberals and conservatives after the devastating Thousand Days War. A constitutional reform was enacted to prevent authoritarianism by reducing presidential terms and prohibiting immediate re-election. Argentina. Argentina celebrated the centennial of the May Revolution in 1910 with lavish events intended to showcase a modern, prosperous nation. However, the splendor masked deep social fractures. To suppress anarchist-led strikes and labor unrest during the festivities, the government declared a state of siege and passed the Social Defense Law, which allowed for the deportation and arrest of activists. Brazil. In November 1910, the Revolt of the Lache, Revolta de Chibata, erupted. Afro-Brazilian sailors rebelled against the use of corporal punishment in the Navy. The use of the whip, a holdover from the era of slavery, abolished only in 1888, exposed the deep racial inequalities persisting in the Brazilian state. Chile. Chile also celebrated its centennial in 1910, but the atmosphere was darkened by the deaths of two sitting presidents, Pedro Montt and Elias Fernandez Albano, within weeks of each other. This political vacuum highlighted the fragility of the Chilean parliamentary system. Conclusion: a pivotal year. Viewed in perspective, 1910 was a turning point in world history. While Mexico was beginning a social revolution, the rest of the planet showed clear symptoms of an old order crumbling. In Europe, diplomatic crises and an arms race set the stage for total war. In Asia, the Chinese and Ottoman empires attempted too late reforms, while Japan consolidated colonial power. In the Americas, the celebration of progress coexisted with strikes, repression, and interventionism. The Mexican Revolution was not an isolated event, but part of a global wave of tension and resistance. As the saying goes, a people that does not know its history is condemned to repeat it.